Welcome to the Business of Sustainability podcast from Future Plus, where smart businesses turn sustainability challenges into a competitive advantage. I'm Alex Smith, bringing you real conversations with leaders who are transforming ESG pressures into opportunities for growth, innovation, and stronger business performance. Today, I'm joined by Nick McClelland, CEO of Byrne Dean, a consultancy that has spent more than 20 years helping some of the world's largest organisations build kinder, fairer, and higher performing workplaces. We're going to explore why workplace culture is no longer just a HR issue, but a serious commercial and sustainability priority in a world being shaped by AI, performance pressure, and changing expectations around work. Nick, it's an absolute pleasure to have you on the show. And you've got a really interesting background, quite a mix: law, professional rugby, a long career in HR and workplace benefits consulting, and now you're leading Byrne Dean. Can you give us a quick introduction, who you are, what you do, and how you got here?
Yeah, I can certainly try. I guess it is a bit of an interesting background coming from professional sport into an arena I knew nothing about, which was employee benefits about 20 years ago. And that kind of gave me the entrance into the world of HR, which I had no clue about whenever I started on that journey. But over the last 20 or so years, have spent time in benefits and health and well-being, and most recently in workplace behaviour, which has probably been the most interesting 2 years of the whole 20 so far.
Yeah, I can only but imagine. Workplace behaviour, we've had a small conversation on the podcast about it before, but it would be really interesting to get sort of where you sit on it. And you have spent a long time working on organisations on that workplace culture and leadership. And recently you've written a few articles around AI. You've been talking on social media around performance pressure and what those changing expectations are around work, which I found hugely interesting and useful. But I suppose the question is to you, do you think we are really fundamentally entering an era where everything is about to change and how businesses think about people is about to change?
I firmly believe we're entering one of the most challenging periods we've ever seen in the workplace, particularly the modern workplace. And yes, that's led by the significant changes AI is going to bring into to work, but there are so many other challenges right now in managing people, and the pressure has never been higher on leadership, on managers to drive performance, to manage risks, and to do all of that whilst we're going through another huge revolution in the world of work. Makes it a significantly complex period, particularly for HR, but people leaders generally, and therefore the sustainability of work, I think, is very much in question right now, given some of the challenges we have faced over the last few years, not least a pandemic and threats of future ones are on the horizon as well, along with this significant technological change as well.
And what is it that Byrne Dean does how do you work with organisations around some of those topics?
Yeah, it's we're quite specialist in a way. The team that has been built up over the past 23 years typically come from employment law. So they've worked at the coalface of really difficult employment issues, employee issues, mainly in the corporate city space, and financial services has been a particular strength for the organisation. And it was that sort of combination of former lawyers who were probably a little bit frustrated with seeing all of those difficult people issues bear out in quite a legalistic way, looking for something alternative, looking for an approach that was more preventative in its nature, coming back to creating organizations that really think through their workplace culture, think through what those risks might be rather than reacting, which is typically how many workplace issues develop.
I mean, I suppose there's a sort of like slightly old school, which might still prevail, idea around workplace culture being a soft issue. Do you think that perception still exists and persists in businesses? Or are you starting to see that leadership and management are now turning the tables and starting to understand that, there's a risk there which is commercially and operationally considerable?
I think we've probably taken backward steps actually more recently. I think there has been a lot of progression, but the sort of narrative around culture being soft has definitely dialed up again more significantly in the past 2 years, I would say, than before. So if you go back to sort of pre-pandemic into the pandemic period in particular, you had a sharp focus on employee well-being and what it meant to look after people from a health and well-being perspective. We had a hugely sharp focus on equity, equity, diversity, and inclusion, and both of those things have seen significant backward steps in the last few years. And I think organizations are really focused on driving performance, managing risk, and those two things are, I think, back in the soft and fluffy bucket somewhat. And actually, they should be seen as organizational risks. They should be seen as organizational performance drivers. But I think, sadly, when the pressure's on, and I think in difficult economic times that we're in right now for many organizations, when the pressure's on, organizations tend to revert back. And I think we've seen a lot of that over the past 2 years. And if it's not driving performance really tangibly and clearly right now, or it's not managing risk, then frankly, it's in the discretionary bucket. And that's, I think it's a bit of a sad state of affairs at the moment that we're certainly seeing.
And I mean, we always talk about, I mean, not dissimilar to sustainability, as in it's something you have to build in and embed. Otherwise, you start to have unexpected costs towards the business, which you can't quite pinpoint, but fundamentally sit around the same sort of ES and G concepts. Are you, when you go in and speak to CFOs and CEOs, are you able to speak to them about what poor workplace culture actually costs them? And are they listening to those messages?
A lot of the data in all of these topics, if we use culture broadly, but we could drill down into any aspect of that, it tends to be almost too big for organizations to get their head around. So if you take sort of recent studies as an example, I would throw out something like the Gallup report, which says worldwide we've got our lowest ever engagement scores from employees at 20%. And in the UK, it's even worse. It's at 10%, apparently. But I think when you factor in that sort of stat to a CEO or a CFO who are making financial decisions for an organization, it almost becomes too big to be tangible enough to worry about. And the only thing that they can actually focus on is the sort of specifics of numbers and performance in their respective P&Ls and business units that they operate. So when you turn up and start to talk about those sort of clear and obvious benefits to having a great workplace culture, so you have lower attrition, you'll have higher engaged, more productive employees, you're going to have less health issues in the workplace. All of those things, people know, they understand it, but I think they find it really hard to get that tangible link inside their own environments. So as much as you can turn up with that narrative at the moment, I think that's when the soft and fluffy stuff starts to play out a little bit again. And we, at the moment, prefer to turn up and think about how organizations can manage those risks more effectively, can drive that performance more effectively, and make that tangible link as closely as possible. But the data around it is quite hard to extract from companies, as I'm sure you know.
That submerged value, which everybody appreciates and nobody can quite quantify.
Correct. Exactly that.
Yeah, absolutely. And you sort of talked a little bit then about culture and it having various different sort of terms. How do you define what workplace culture is, or how do you talk to people about what it means to have a positive workplace culture?
I think even the word culture is a bit problematic at the moment. And we don't want to lose that from the narrative, and we keep it very much as part of how we position ourselves. Today we talk about being culture experts and being people risk experts, and we sort of try and get the balance right between positive workplace culture conversations and balancing and managing those people risks. The truth is that actually what you're really in control of an organization is where most companies should focus right now. And I think it's interesting, you could draw different parallels in different parts of cultural, but if I focus in on a little bit more of my sort of previous background of, say, well-being as an example, there's been a lot of money spent by organizations on well-being, products, benefits, perks, systems, apps, etc. I've been part of that world. I've seen the effort and energy that went into it. And a lot of private equity money went in behind the scenes to make it successful. So there's a lot of people who have wanted that to be a successful sort of mini industry within the culture sphere. But for me, the truth is, and this is probably coming to Byrne Dean, has sort of woken me up to this to a certain degree, which is actually there's only so much from a cultural perspective that organizations can really control. And for me, that's the experience they get as they step over the threshold of work that day, whether it's their home office, whether it's an actual physical office in a town somewhere. When they step over that threshold, how they experience work is what an organization can actually control. And so to tighten in on that slightly, I would think about the biggest prevalent factor in all of this is the experience you have with your manager or leader, depending on the level you're at in an organization. Certainly in big organizations, that gets incredibly complex. It's the experience you have with colleagues and how you're treated. And that probably leans into the words kindness and fairness, which again are misunderstood and seen as soft and fluffy, but we can come back to that. That experience you have, those are things that organizations can control. You can't control whether somebody is going to have a healthier diet or whether they're going to go to a meditation class or yoga class. You can put free fruit out, but it doesn't mean that's going to achieve anything from that perspective. What does matter is how you're treated inside the workplace and what can be controlled by an organization. And I think in this whole narrative around culture, around how we look after people, that gets missed a lot of the time.
Yeah, I think that's very fair. I think I'd also love to come back to that kindness and fairness. Yeah. We use the word joy. And I read something actually interesting the weekend, which has stuck with me. It says joy is a biological imperative. Right. We have so many things biologically functionally, which are linked to joy, which help us be healthier, happier people. Yeah. But I get the same reaction to the word joy as I imagine you get to kindness and fairness, where people sort of raise an eyebrow and sort of dip their head. Is there it's quite important words that you fit into explaining what the company does, yeah. But I think maybe it would be worth digging into that a little bit more.
Yeah, I mean, it's in our purpose statement. We, to create kind and fair workplaces, and that is why we exist, and that's what we want to achieve. But I think the words are misunderstood, and kindness, I think in particular, has sort of almost got a bad rep now because of the be kind sort of narratives that kind of appeared and the memes that appeared on the internet around it and so on. Kindness is often things that people don't think about. Kindness is having a difficult conversation with somebody about their performance. Kindness is being honest with people about their career progression, as an example, or giving direct feedback in an interview process as to why somebody doesn't get a job. These are difficult things. Those are what being kind actually means in the workplace context, as well as respectful. I mean, that's really important as well, and that word's important to us as well. Fairness is how you're treated, coming back to the environment an organization can create. And those sort of, if you look at sort of some of the stats around workplace conflict on the increase, ridiculously long waiting times for employment tribunals to take place, it's because of this increase in workplace conflict. And fundamentally underneath all of that, it often is because there's a perception of unfair treatment happening inside a company. And so that's why these things are really important, because all of that equates to costs that organizations should be focused on. But sadly, they don't always see the direct link between how a manager or an employee treats another individual and that cost increase itself.
Yeah, absolutely. I suppose when companies come to you, is it because they're being proactive? Or are they being reactive? Because is it the problem has happened and they've realised they've got something to solve? Or are we luckily in a place where companies are going, I don't want the problem to happen?
It's a little bit of both. Well, it's a little bit of one and a lot of the other. That's probably the right way to put it. It's a little bit of proactivity. It's a lot of reactivity. The way we often try to think about this and visualise it when we're having a conversation with clients is around a timeline. There is often in the workplace explosive events that happen, and they can absolutely be prevented. They can be prevented with better training. They can be prevented with stronger management, with proper kindness and fairness principles embedded inside an organization. But again, coming back to the challenge we've just been talking about, if the preventive investment hasn't happened, the likelihood of those explosive events increases at all times. So therefore, the volume of calls we get from clients do tend to be in reaction to an explosive event where they need to take some retrospective action. And we need to be able to play on both sides of that event, if that makes sense. I would much rather be having lots of conversations with companies in a positive, preventative way about creating a positive workplace culture, and there hasn't been issues prior. But in reality, most organizations, especially mature companies, have always had continuous issues. So it's more reactive than preventative, but it doesn't mean that you can't draw the circle back and start afresh and recreate the culture, the environment, the climate that does lead to less issues in the future.
There was I believe it was a YouGov, and I apologise if I get it wrong, we'll correct it, but I think there's a YouGov survey that came out recently around age groups and how lucky they felt to have been born into their particular generation. So from Gen Z all the way through to boomers. And essentially, as it's very, very low in 18 to 24-year-olds. Gets slightly higher as you get to millennials, and then sort of the most lucky, I think it was like nearly 70% felt lucky that they'd been born in sort of boomer. Just in some of that conflict that you were talking about, are you finding any intergenerational conflict in businesses that is maybe unexpected by more senior leadership that are likely to be in those older age groups?
Yeah, it's more complex and nuanced than that when you start to think about the global aspect as well. But yes, and a couple of examples probably just help to bring it to life a little bit. Good examples would be how different generations view communications. So you've got something simple like how we text communicate using emojis and memes and GIFs and so on. And you have an expectation in our private lives that that's normal. Depending on your generation, you will likely deem that type of communication as either completely normal if you're younger and maybe completely inappropriate if you're older. Now, I'm generalizing, but in principle, that's a sort of sweeping statement across generations. But if you start to then layer that into the communication vehicles that are available inside a company today, not least moving from email towards things like Teams and Slack, even just the sort of misunderstanding of an emoji can create conflict inside an organization. And if you then layer in complex global factors like our current politics, political situation, polarization generally as a theme that we're seeing certainly in the Western world, in the US and the UK in particular, then you've got communication vehicles where people can be misunderstood and people are having blurrier lines as to what they bring to work in terms of things like political views and so on. So when you start to layer in the generational aspect of what people see as normal, again, generalizing, but if you were older, you probably left your political views at the door of work 10, 20 years ago. Today, it would be very normal for people to be quite comfortable expressing their political views. And just the very nature of the fact that one group might think it's inappropriate to have that discussion and the other think it's perfectly normal, that itself can create conflict, let alone the fact that the views might be different as well.
The other big gap that I think, everybody is seeing, and you've written a lot about this, around expectation gap around AI, which I imagine has a bit of a generational impact as well. But leaders are expecting massive major productivity gains. I mean, there's I think it's Meta that said they're going to get rid of 10% of their employees over the next sort of couple of weeks, I think it is, if it's not already happening now, and that employees often aren't delivering. I think you've written a lot about businesses not underestimating the emotional and psychological impact and response that employees have towards that. And we see it a lot with SMEs. I find we're in a really interesting place around responsible adoption of AI, what it looks like, how it feels like, what businesses do in a variety of different ways. And we're frequently in conversations now, sort of ESG. But, how are you seeing that play out with the companies that you're working with?
Yeah, it's this area, I think we're only tip of the iceberg in terms of where I think problems might start to develop that people haven't even predicted yet. There's a couple of gaps developing, I think, around AI, but the expectation one sits above everything else at the moment, which is, as you say, most shareholders of an organization, whoever that might be, small, medium or large, could be partnerships. There is this growing expectation that radical efficiency gains are going to be had through this miraculous technology. And don't get me wrong, the technology is incredible. My main concern is that we're really overestimating our ability to get that technology into what is an inherently complex work environment from two different perspectives. The first is probably simpler to understand in some ways, which is that organizations have incredibly complex technological setups anyway, particularly big organizations where you've got different tech stacks around and you're layering AI on top of that. And if you've got an unintelligent operating system because it's been patched together over 20 years.
Legacy systems.
All that,
Yep.
exactly. You're not going to get much intelligence out of that, really. But the more complex issue, and what I think you're really asking about in some ways, is when you layer that into the human aspect of an organization, all the little ways and means of, coming back to culture, the culture of an organization, the climate of an organization, the way people work, that's another layer of complexity that we struggle to understand at the best of times. Layer in this new technology, which I think I've used the phrase recently, it's like turkeys voting for Christmas. There's employees being asked to use this technology to gain efficiencies whilst this other narrative sits above them, which is that they might lose their job if this really works very well. So of course that's going to create a whole bunch of complexities around psychology and how the organizational psychology works within that. And, quiet rebellions, dismissiveness, all of these things, employees are going to be showcasing. And the darker side of that is where it could be misused. There's going to be ethical issues around how it could be used. And I think layering in things like capability and judgment on it increase the complexity severely.
Yeah, it's that when tech bumps into humans issue, I think, and we talk a lot about the ethical stuff. I mean, especially in your sort of world, like bias being built into it, where the human, we had somebody talking recently about supply chains and procurement, but not having a human in the loop, but having a human in control. And I thought it was a really good term because you have to have somebody with enough confidence and understanding of the business and of the AI in order to feel that they can override something which everybody else is pushing for. I think it's going to be hugely interesting to see what happens, but I keep coming back to the same line in my head when it comes to AI, to whose benefit. Yeah. And I think businesses really need to consider across all of its stakeholders, if they implement this, to whose benefit and to what impact.
I think there's one aspect which, I'll be careful what I say maybe, but there's definitely been a bit of fear mongering around AI, and to whose benefit is an interesting question as to what that fear mongering's driving. It's certainly driving adoption in our private lives, the sort of increase of people using various large language models to plan their holidays as well as do work behind the scenes or potentially risky client related work with data that they shouldn't be using behind the scenes as well. But it's been an incredibly effective strategy to get adoption very fast on this technology. And I think, again, there's a sort of narrative that builds up around what AI is capable of, because there are going to be some very interested parties in it being successful. But again, I come back to the actual practical implications of layering that into a complex organization, large organization, global organization. It could take years for us to really understand where the value is and, again, see the benefits across the board, which is what I would hope for.
Yeah, I was having a conversation actually just this morning around some of the work that we do, and we spend quite a lot of time thinking about what is it that AI can't do. We absolutely maintain that it might be able to tell you information, but it doesn't have that background knowledge and nuance and understanding, particularly around things like implementation into human environments, whether they be part technological or not. But I suppose part of our thinking behind that is we want to make sure that we're still around in the future. I mean, I suppose your industry as well, do you have concerns that people start dropping off and just start asking Claude?
100%. I mean, look, I sit there and run a business where I need to ensure that it is a profitable, sustainable enterprise. And AI has got to be part of that. And we try to look at AI through a few different lenses as a business ourselves, as well as having our view on how that impacts our clients' world and the individuals that work within our clients' world. So, we've all got to be on top of this. It's not going away. It's, I'm not a naysayer. I'm 100% believer that this is game-changing technology that is going to hopefully, used the right way, help us progress the workplace in particular if we're focused in on, the the corporate aspect of it, but there's so many worldwide benefits, social benefits that can come from this technology that of course we should be pushing it and seeing where we can go with it. But the judgment part in all of this is really important. We need to ensure that there is that human judgment layer and that we're equipped managerially, leadership-wise, to understand our responsibility inside an organization to get that right. And there are already some high-profile situations where that's not happened, and the reputational risk for organizations getting that wrong are significant.
The understanding of accountability and responsibility, who is in charge of what if something happens, if it wasn't decided by a human, but also if it impacts your employees and stakeholders, what that looks like is going to potentially keep you guys busy.
It's definitely keep us busy. I think one of the teams that we have in the business is an investigations team. So the majority of work we've done over the sort of 23 years or so of the company has been training work. Over the last sort of 3 or 4 years, we've seen this sort of really fast growing part of our business, which is really around investigations and mediations. And it's not surprising it's been growing because, of course, if conflicts on the increase, there's more investigations. But it's even in the process around investigations where AI has bubbled up in ways we couldn't have anticipated a year ago, 2 years ago. Employees filing complaints to their employer that were clearly written by AI, and we're talking pages and pages and pages of it. And more recently, we've seen scenarios where even at the HR end or even in the legal team, external or internal, have been using AI in response to those. So we're now getting scenarios where AI is talking to AI.
One smart speaker talking to another smart speaker. I think someone put it the other day.
Exactly, but in an inherently human situation, and how much is being lost in that conversation, and how much nuance is dropped. And I think these are the things that are going to challenge us in the workplace more than we've seen before.
I suppose in the last few years, we've the changes in workplaces have been coming thick and fast. We had COVID, which is sort of becoming a bit of a distant memory, but I think potentially the impact of that is still sort of well and truly here. And that I think fundamentally changed is hybrid and remote working. The amount of people I say that almost laugh at the idea of going into the office 5 days a week now, at all levels. Yeah. It seems entirely ridiculous that we would spend that much time travelling and not just cracking on and getting on with work. But have you found that has made it harder to have those conversations with businesses around, behavioural challenges, and or has it just made problems that were already there potentially more visible or even less visible because people just... I think somebody the other day, there was a tech bro who said he'd fired his HR department because they kept on coming up with problems, and since they've gone, he doesn't have any problems anymore, which I think might suggest that nobody's just telling him about the problems rather than the problems have gone. I think he might just be stacking those up behind him for the future. Yeah. But how are companies do you find that are they still challenged by it, or are we there now and it's all...
No, we're still definitely challenged by it. I think there's so many benefits to what is now. I think we're safe using the word hybrid as probably the default mechanism. I don't know anybody who works 5 days a week in an office anymore. The benefits from a societal point of view, from a family point of view, I think have been very clear. And I think that organizations that have been on the strong mandate have probably, to come back to the office, are probably been in that fear place for a little while as well. So you kind of get a mixture of messages around it. What is very clear, I think, is that it hides more than it surfaces, because so much of the tension that might be very visible in an office environment is not seen. So if you have a call between two colleagues and it's not an easy call, it's a difficult call about collaboration, working together, solving a problem about one of the people in their teams, whatever it might be, it's very easy when the screen goes off and the Zoom call ends, the Teams call ends, for it just to disappear. But that's just a bubbling first notch on the kind of conflict timeline, if you like. And if you come back to the office environment and the benefits of it, if that conversation was taking place in the kitchen, it would be overseen. If it was taking place at a desk or in a meeting room with other managers or whatever it might be, there's more chance of those things being surfaced. And again, thinking about interventions and prevention, more chance of those things being effectively managed earlier in the timeline. So I think that is a significant challenge. What isn't visible will not get dealt with. And again, if you don't have the visible data points, which we've talked about already being quite challenging, and you don't then have that sort of physical ability to see conflict, tension in the room, that's clearly going to create issues for organizations in unsaid or unspoken truths that speak to culture but are not surfaced. And I think hybrid will continue to provide that unless we find better ways to navigate that. And that comes back to some of the culture work, I think, that organizations need to look at.
I think a lot of that expectation, and we talk about it, sort of leaders and leadership need to be able to understand it and do it. But do you think they get enough support in organisations to be able to recognise and to surface and to understand even what data would look like, even if they wanted to get there? Or is actually that maybe is that a starting point for a lot of organisations, is actually making sure the managers are supported and understand what's expected of them?
It should be the starting point. I think the level of expectation on a manager today is completely unrealistic. And I've seen that steadily increase in my career, where many people don't want or plan to be in a management or leadership position. They get there by the nature of the fact that they were good at their job. Mm-hmm. Some people are made for it and are very natural in those sort of positions. Most are not. And yet over the past, particularly the last 10 years, and you factor in the pandemic years into that, with everything we've just talked about with hybrid, all we've done is add complexity to the manager's role. And the investment in that group from a training perspective, in supporting them, in helping them understand some of the implications. I mean, even just this year in the UK, if you're in financial services, you've got massive regulation focus on behaviours in the workplace. You've got a huge raft of changes with the Employment Rights Act coming in, and all the pressure and all the focus will end up on managers as well. And by the way, they're also dealing with all the AI challenges, and they're being asked to get adoption and all of those sort of things as well.
Encourage people to do it. Tell them they're not going to lose their jobs, might lose their jobs.
Exactly. I mean, who would choose to be a manager these days? You find yourselves there, and then you find yourselves under-equipped. You've got a capability gap, and potentially then that judgment gap we've already talked about. So if you're going to do one thing as an organization in the next 3-5 years, it is really think strategically about who you want to have in your management positions, not just the greatest performer, naturally wanting to get up the sort of the ladder quicker, faster, whatever it might be, and invest in that group of people so that they can effectively manage, not ask them to be everything, performer, individual contributor, and manager, and AI evangelist, and everything else that you're expected to do in this new era of work.
Is there anything else that you find that businesses that are doing this well are starting with or have implemented that are sort of really good base foundations for businesses that might just be, I don't know, scaling to the point where actually this is starting to become more structured into what they're doing, or that maybe even mature businesses that probably should have started that maybe haven't?
I think it's interesting. So if I look at two different types of companies, if you look at sort of scale up, faster growing organizations that might have started small and they get to that kind of crux point, it's often around 100 to 150 employees where they need to start having a little bit more robustness around policies, practices, procedures that they maybe haven't had before. That's your best opportunity to sort of set the foundations moving forward. And I think in any of the situations I talk about, there's very rarely ill intent. Even our friend who acts as HR team recently, that you mentioned earlier on, there's probably not ill intent there. It may be naive, but not ill intent. Most organizations, I think, don't set out to create a poor culture. They don't set out to create an environment where people aren't happy and productive. But that scale-up organization has a better opportunity to address it early on if they get some of the fundamentals right. And choosing to invest in the kind of fundamentals around management, as an example, that's a big decision for a smaller company that maybe doesn't have the resources, but yet it's probably one of the most fundamental and important decisions they make right now. The mature organization is an entirely different kettle of fish because there's so much unpicking and complexity within that, and a fight for budgets around a whole host of different priorities, that there often is budget to do something around managers, but it's not focused, and it's not focused in the right area because it's been devolved so much in the complexity that it effectively comes down to an individual's preferences, who's making the decisions about, say, the learning and development strategy as an example. So that's something that I think, if I was advising mature organizations to look at, who've been promoting HR directors and CPOs to the board, is to really think about skills, to think about capability, to think about judgment as a core focus for their business as we go into this new era of AI, as we still adapt to hybrid, and actually put energy and effort behind that and test small, because of course getting some evidence that if you can test it in a small area and show that it works, that's going to prove the business case for you to go further with it.
So something that we are huge champions of is measurement, of actually understanding, so that you have some data to be able to make intelligent decisions of. So, ourselves and other ESG frameworks are increasingly asking businesses to report on social metrics, employee wellbeing, inclusion, as part of the S and the G of ESG. How should businesses think about measuring culture, or choose another word, beyond sort of an annual engagement survey? What is it? Where should they be starting?
Yeah, I mean, it can't be annual. That's just, in today's world, the speed we're moving at, that's just, we should be moving past that very quickly in any organization. I think the challenge with all of this data is where it all sits. It's really hard to get and extract all the data. And I think the biggest opportunity AI provides in this space right now is actually the aggregation ability, and to provide insights across scattered data sets that provide that. And I know that's something that you're very passionate about as well. The key, again, coming back to what I said earlier, is if you've got that strategic role now, data's got to be part of the HR remit, and it's got to be really clear what you want to measure from a climate, environment, cultural perspective inside your organization. And that could be different depending on your size and scale and your global footprint, but be very clear about what you're measuring and do it regularly, and use the technology that's coming in like AI to get that as a key people risk cultural dashboard item that sits on your board agenda every month.
This has been a fascinating conversation. I wish I could keep going, Nick, but last question for you. If we fast forward 10 years, what do you think is going to separate the organisations that have successfully balanced that work performance, technology, and the human experience in businesses, potentially from those that didn't?
Balance, I think, is the word I would use. Everybody has got to be thinking progressively, particularly around AI and the technology that is revolutionising the workplace and the workday. Getting the balance right of how your organisation moves at the right speed. But I come back to it, and I don't think I can emphasize it enough. I think the organizations that will make the fastest progress will be the ones that take the responsibility of management and leadership seriously in that time, invest in that group of people, help them understand that the soft and fluffy things like kindness and fairness actually are hard metrics inside an organization today, and that they should be part of that regular review. If you get that right, you're going to naturally create an environment that people want to be part of. You're going to keep great people who want to do great work and that feel that they're still progressing with things like AI and technology. I think those will be the successful organizations we look at. The ones that don't do that, I think will just be fighting the whole time, and that won't be a nice environment for employees to be part of.
Thank you so much for this absolutely fascinating conversation. I think the whole host of, I think maybe we should come back for a part 2, to be honest. There's probably so much more to speak about, especially around the AI and what that looks like for businesses. So thank you ever so much. But to find out more about Byrne Dean, you can visit byrnedean.com. For more episodes and resources on building a sustainable, responsible business, you can head to future-plus.co.uk. You can subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and we will see you next time. So thank you ever so much.
Thank you for having me.